Hello? Can anyone hear me out there? The static flickered in and out, coarse and empty. This is Technician Valrose of the Liberty. The ship has 98% damage. Too ready for immediate evacuation. I repeat, too ready for immediate evacuation. I sent out the message throughout the various frequencies, both close range and long range, into the depths of space. The faint beeping of my equipment told me it was successfully sent out, all in the faint hope I would receive a reply. I waited for a moment afterward, hoping against hope that I be blissfully rewarded with a transmission, a reply, a chance to hear another human voice, and the promise of assistance, only for a dreaded silence to return. Resting my head on the flight deck panel of the ship, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space, I knew there was a strong likelihood that I would die, all alone. Outside the window, the remnants of the destroyed planet continued to linger. The impact caused it to spin off its center, leaving a large crater, and I doubted it could support life now. Both the ozone layer, artificial and natural, was gone, allowing the sun's powerful rays to penetrate. It all happened so rapidly, and then our world, our universe, had changed. The broken shells of spaceships, drifting surrounded by fuel, and the scattered remains of life. I doubted anything had been spared from this twisted fate. From what I saw, none managed to break away from the planet without perishing from the impact. The only thing protecting me from the radiation were the energy shields. Boulders struck and disintegrated into smaller, impotent shards that bounced off the surface. Perhaps one broadcast managed to be heard, or there would be help on the way from one of the outer colonies. I couldn't risk wasting too much power to keep sending out too many beacons. With the press of a button, I checked my timer and pressed it to initiate a countdown sequence. The red numbers counted down from the 2-hour mark. Each second made a faint, infernal beep that would plague me, reminding me of my own steady heartbeat. How soon would it pass? From behind me was a low scratching, and then a banging on the door. It was the only way into the flight deck. It was small, given the design of the ship. I turned my head in the direction of the sound. It had gotten fainter over the past couple of weeks. For a moment, I nearly forgot the desperate measures. The scraping continued, and limping with my right leg, I made my way to the door. The rotting, sickly smell of an infection clung thick in the air, and unable to escape it, I had to endure it, my foot dragging along the ground. I held down the intercom button, waiting and listening, while only a desolate silence echoed. Most of the camera and surveillance systems had been damaged, or sent reduced power to ensure the flight deck had enough. Leaning closer, the scraping and banging started again.
Please, help. I'm still alive.
I snapped my finger off the button, jerked backwards, nearly misplacing my feet, stumbling feebly, and stared in horror at the closed door. My breathing was rapid, and I wondered if the silence and isolation was finally getting to me. I itched to know what remained behind it, but over time, it had gotten quiet. Why would it be speaking to me now? How could they still be alive? No human could still be out there. The gaping holes in those parts of the hull would have allowed oxygen to escape, allowing the chill of space to enter. The initial strike, where another ship tried to also escape the blast, crashing into the side, causing the thrusters to fail, and devastating casualties to the crew. I had been in the maintenance bay, patching up some of the wiring, until the disaster struck, and dragging the wounded to the overflowing med bay. Crowds of injured or maimed people were taken outside, dropped off, while other people ran to their posts to repair the damage. Emergency drills had been ingrained into our heads, yet still, there was panic. A loud banging sound caused a pipe to break. It fell and struck me in the leg, causing my thigh bone to break, only to have a commanding officer pull me aside, telling me to start the beacon. Depraved screams echo through the intercom, telling us people were burning and were trapped inside parts of the ship, and they were locked inside. I went to open the door, only to have him take my hand to prevent me. He said something to me, but I couldn't hear it with all the screaming and crashing metal sounds around us. Still, I knew what he wanted me to do.
Quickly, get inside.
He tried to reach another crew member, but either they ignored him or they couldn't hear as they ran past.
We can't open the doors again.
We have to let them die? I stared up at him, horrified by the words, and reached to press it. Explosions and increased fires blasted behind us, causing a symphony of screams coming from the survivors. The ship tilted upright, causing us to grip onto the sides. I managed to make my way through, only for the doors to emergency lock behind us, and soon our bodies were pressed on the wall. The lights flickered, and he fell forward, cracking his head open, passing out, and laying limp on the ground. The auxiliary power came back. I pressed the buttons, instantly receiving damage reports, and then pressed the emergency one to send out an automatic distress call. The cameras outside the room showed smoke, and wounded people crawled toward the door, striking at it with their fists. I pressed the button to open the door, only for the AI system to warn me not to open it. When I tried to override it, it was locked on a ship-wide level. If I had enough time, I could hack into it and make a workaround. Moments like these, I cursed my lack of clearance. They were screaming, infernal sounds that haunted me. They waved in front of the camera, desperate to get our attention, and knowing soon they would be amongst the dead. I heard another sharp crack, looking backward to see Washington smashed his head on the floor during the second collision of debris. It was much larger than the one before. He whimpered, lifting his head up, blood trickling from his forehead, and reached up before resting his head down. He never lifted it up again. "This is Technician Valrose of the Liberty. Please come in. We've had a massive accident, please." I called on the radio. There was a sharp light outside the main window. I covered my eyes, and fortunately, her shields held true. I blinked repeatedly, and it took a moment for my eyes to readjust. They were cloudy with white dots in front of them, before my vision returned to normal. "I repeat, this is Technician Valrose of the Liberty." The strikes went silent, and I breathed a sigh of relief, only for them to begin again. Outside the door was a mass of twisted raw pieces, writhing and reaching up to the camera. They no longer had skin. Their uniforms were burnt off, and when their heads tilted backward, their hair would flip off like wigs, leaving nothing but a pink exposed skull. Some tried to cling onto it, conserving what was left of their humanity. while others permitted it to slip and fall off, pulling down the skin with it. I covered my mouth, unable to move, and soon the contents of my stomach erupted onto the command console, all due to the horrific sight. I watched as the gruesome pile twisted and turned, broken bone pulled on each other as they climbed on top, ripping each other apart, before finally their cries died down. My eyes were locked in the scene before me. I couldn't prevent their end. I couldn't stop it from happening. I couldn't prevent it, figuring I could still help my commanding officer. Wiping my mouth, I walked over and knelt beside him, my knees now red from his blood. I used 2 fingers pressed on his neck to feel for a pulse, a sign of life. It was there, but faint. I looked for something to prop his head up. His name tag said, Washington. The flight deck had rudimentary supplies available. I opened up one of the cupboards, taking out a medical kit and opening it up. I cleaned his head wound while trying to stop the bleeding. It wasn't enough. But if I could get him back on his feet, he would be able to help me. He still rested, and tenderly, I placed his head back down on the floor. Then there was that low, thumping sound hitting the door. I didn't know how much time had passed. My routine consisted of checking to see if we'd been hailed, sending out the distress call, checking and feeding us both. The steady beeping and hum of the auxiliary engine gave me a brief sense of peace. The carnage outside was difficult to ignore. However, this was our little sanctuary away from the reaping outside. He hadn't left me. My friend, my love, lay where I had left him, immobile and lifeless. His skin was grey, all the muscle withdrawn, and I had been tempted to consume him after witnessing the horrors outside. The thought of desecrating his flesh tormented me. I walked to him. The red blood puddle had become a brown, dry one. I lowered my body down and offered a straw to his lips so he could take a sip. He never did any more. His lips thinned, his eyeballs had turned to liquid, and later a crusty gel that leaked from his eyelids. Tenderly, I stroked his hair. Occasionally he'd whisper to me, reassuring me, "Don't worry, they'll rescue us soon," I murmured, lying to us both. I leaned down to kiss his forehead and gaze out at the broken skyline. Thus far, oxygen levels had remained stable, and food supplies were limited and heavily rationed to ensure survival. I considered them no longer present, the empty packaging residing in the bin. My stomach no longer ached like it used to. Tales of old whispered of a place torn between heaven and hell, where a final resting place was denied. Purgatory? Was that where I was now? The countdown showed I'd have to soon reach out through the cosmos for someone to help. Either oxygen or power levels would decrease. I didn't want to listen to the old emergency beacons and distress calls. They haunted me. Yet, they were the only other human voices I'd hear. However, the urge was too much to bear. I placed my finger down to pick up the signal, only to receive nothing but multiple streams of static. Wincing, it soon passed. Then the panicked voices came through in a blur.
Mayday! Mayday! We need immediate evacuation!
Help us, please!
There are so many wounded. Help us, please.
This is our end. We had a good run.
I recognized her, a war veteran, and she took a mouthful of liquid before I heard a gun being fired. Children crying, calls of the end of days, pleas of help, and the ease of some who accepted their fate. There had to be thousands of different voices, calling out into the empty void. Many blurred together. However, these were the ones who stood out the most. 2 days after the initial incident, half of the broadcast became the automated systems, sending out calls for help. I figured a majority of the humans were too injured to speak, or had passed away. The striking continued, and I ignored it, waiting for the dread feeling when one of the voices on the radio changed. Hello? Please. There are so many wounded. We can't treat them all. I don't know if we're going to make it. I remembered the helplessness I felt. I'm not proud of this. Even when the broadcasts were muted, I could still hear them echoing and circling inside my mind, plaguing me, taunting me for my helplessness. I remembered hacking into their network, only to be greeted with happy messages of people on the verge of rescue, before the hurt, betrayal, and sheer disbelief. They screamed, preparing for their inevitable demise. I switched off their emergency beacon, but one last transmission came through. Why? Why would you do this to us? It stopped. I listened to others, all recordings. Some were filled with untold remorse and admissions of sins that no longer mattered. All human experiences of life, death, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. A wave called out with voices that no longer spoke. It sounded like that ship had many survivors on it, families, children, and yet the desire to survive outweighed any responsibilities I had. I looked over my shoulder, expecting the critical gaze of the captain. Would he disapprove? I shouldn't have done what I did. What if they were the last survivors left, and I condemned them? Worse, I did so for my own selfish gain. After all, he closed the door to leave the rest of our crew, people we knew and worked with, to perish, leaving them there. Or perhaps, if he were awake and I was on the floor, lingering between life and death, he would have been able to handle things. The 3 thumps hit. Please be quiet, I whispered to myself, to those outside the door, and neither were willing to comply with me. Sitting on the chair, I drew my legs up around my body and tightly wrapped my arms around me. The 3 struck the door again. I pressed the button to try to view the camera outside, remembering that I disconnected it, hooked up the wires, and ignored the 3 damn strikes again, pressing it again to see a black screen with faint traces of static greeting me. There were flashes of shadows of the flesh mass, now dry and lifeless. Leaning close to the screen, I couldn't find the source of the noise and frowned. I blinked when I first saw it, rubbed my eyes, and wondered if perhaps I was seeing something. One form in that mess now slowly moved. A human torso, with nothing but a twisted mess of exposed bone and bloody flesh. Arms where the hands had fingers fused together, struck the door, and the realization it had no head sank in. Only the tattered remains of a neck with the vertebrae sticking out of it. How could something like that even exist, let alone be able to act or move? I lifted my finger off the button, only for the image to still appear on the screen, and it faded to black. I don't know what that was. Was that a person? I asked myself out loud. The alarm rang out. I turned it off and picked up the radio. This is Technician Valrose of the Liberty. The ship has 98% damage. 2 ready for evacuation. I repeat, 2 ready for immediate evacuation. I couldn't forget him. I waited. Only a scrambly response greeted me. And I knew it had failed. Again. I opened up the cupboard containing the MREs, stored as part of stereotypical safety precautions that I believe were nothing but a waste of time. Now, they saved my life, lowering them in my hand. I was sure I lost them before. I opened up the plastic bag. Stray packaging from abandoned containers resided, with only 4 packets remaining. When I opened them, they had a wriggling mess of insects, and I closed the bag before throwing it aside. I didn't understand how that could have happened, unless they had been contaminated when they were packaged. I checked the oxygen levels. Fortunately, it was at 92%. It was still low, however, it was stable. I didn't know how long it would last, or when the system would finally fail. Early precautions had allowed people to survive when they were cut off from the mainframe. Crewmates, I knew their faces, or perhaps their names. Now, completely lost to us. I gained an additional month of oxygen supply at their expense. Perhaps they were dead already, or on the brink of death, and the valuable resource would have been pushed into empty space anyway. I don't know which will kill me first. Cold? Oxygen deprivation? Starvation? I asked myself, gazing out at the same scenario. My arms draped around my body, and seated on the chair, I wondered if I should settle the matter myself. The endless unknowing was torture. Would I die alone? A stray, dried corpse drawled over the window, naked with nothing but dry skin lingering on. Fortunately, it was so disfigured I couldn't tell who it belonged to, let alone tell it was a human being in the past. The empty pits where the eyes had been were intoxicating. Who was this? I climbed onto the command console. My hand rested on a thick, reinforced glass, and stared up, hoping they would show some signs of life. The 3 thumps came from the door. I ignored them this time. Who were you? I wanted them to speak to me. Who are you? How did you get outside? I whispered, tenderly stroked the glass, and I thought I saw their fingers curl. Perhaps in a greeting? I hope they just needed some time to wake up.
Please, why won't you let me in?
The voice came from the door. Startled, rubbing my ears to be sure I heard it accurately. Instinctively, I looked at the still figure outside for support, and stared at the door, only to hear those 3 distinct thumps, then toward my sleeping officer, who hadn't moved and had fallen still long ago, and neither offered me any advice on how to proceed. I couldn't let the person in. They were dead. Standing, using the console to support myself, my leg had become useless. dragging behind me and clinging on through rotting flesh.
Let me in, please.
I can't.
Let me in.
Physically, I couldn't. The security system held the metal door closed. Still, maybe I could try something. Suddenly, a rapid static filled the spaceship, with a distorted voice coming through. The ID number 000001. I had to check the number, and pressing a button, I tried to see the source of the voice, and realized it came from the Helios, a scouting vessel that was coming home to resupply. I remembered hearing folk tales about this missing ship, the first of its kind that had been sent out, and it had gotten lost over 500 years ago. The hull was coated in rust, there were no shields active, and I couldn't imagine how anyone could survive inside. I peered past my companion outside in fearful awe. It had been designed to withstand space, and defense in the odd chance they run into hostile alien forces. Other than bacteria or other simple forms of life, nothing had been found. The Helios pushed aside corpses, parts of the various wreckages, with it clinging on the sides, and stayed in orbit within view. For a moment I thought it would crash into the idle Liberty, yet it remained a close distance. The damage to the hull and lack of shield told me that no life could have survived. I peered out. From what I could see, it had fire damage that looked like the source was internal rather than external. The emergency hail remained spotty, and I pressed buttons to clear it. There was less static, yet I couldn't understand what was said. I tried hacking into the system, finally managing to break through, and realized there were two distinct hails. One that was part of the automatic one, mechanical reacting to other machines, and another, more faint, came from an organic form. I tried to decipher whose employment code was used, only to realize it didn't come from one code. Horowitz, Ahmed, G, Diaz, Worthington, and many more. Why did all of them send emergency beacons out? Why would it come back now? The 3 thumps were louder than before. The door creaked on the outside, the sides buckling under the pressure, and the middle bowed inward. Listening to the low ache was torture. Something was lacerating it from the other side. A deliberate attempt, articulate and slow. The 3 thumping sounds echoed, this time inside my mind. A dark red thick gel squeezed through, discovering and creating fresh cracks in the doorframe. And I realized it was the slurry of humans who had been trapped. The metal creaked, bending until it broke, leaving large jagged sides, stretching it to allow the mess of bones and mixed limbs to enter, slithering through until it swirled around the commanding officer. His dry form cracked, and he didn't fight the mass seizing control of him. It was drowning him, and his hollow eyes struck wide open. He gasped, his back arched upward, with his arms, fingers taut, and he froze. I crawled up onto the window, feeling the sharp chill of space on my back, and knowing that the shield was failing. We sat in a stalemate. The red flashing alarm system called out. The splintering glass caused the fused officer's head to face me with a sharp crack. A sliver of an unknown finger shot out, pulling his lips into a gaudy, depraved smile. And that was enough for me. Without a weapon, I beat my hands on the window to the outside. I didn't care if it broke. All I wanted was to die. Bone and metal scraped on the chairs. I kept my chin up, not wanting to give the monstrosity the satisfaction of seeing me die. I rested beside the window, only to have the mass cling around my leg, pulling and squeezing me. I expected it to be painful, and instead it was neither hot nor cold. How was it? What was it? How did it happen? It rose upward with the bones of the ship, coating the walls, and crept up my body, pulling me, fusing with me. Soon I'd become one with it. I could feel a finger move inside my wounded leg. The gel squeezed inside, twisting and turning inside me. A tendril forcing its way up my calf, pushing up between my muscles, and forcing its way, shattering my kneecap, and pushing its way up, torn between anger and fear. I gripped my thigh, trying to force it down and keep it away from me, all whilst being coated in the mass of biological terror. I couldn't escape it. There was nowhere safe to look, either gazing into the skull of my companion outside, or view the broken sky. I hoped that somewhere there was a pocket of humanity that would survive. There had to be one. And thus, I accepted the coming darkness.
You should have let me in.
This is Corbin of the Rising Dawn, Technician Valrose of the Liberty. We heard your call. Are you two still alive?
The call echoed out through the space-filled graveyard. Debris circled aimlessly, with faint calls of the old emergency broadcast, hailing with none but the dead hearing them. Until now, the solitary voice, living, echoed out through space with all the different hails. The journey to the distress call had been a long one, taking close to a year, and the concerned gas of the crew could have matched his own. The planet was now unlivable, broken beyond repair, and utterly destroyed. What could have caused this? He pressed a finger to his radio, bringing it close to his lips.
Ma'am, we arrived. There are no signs of life and oxygen levels are at 0. Scouts are being sent out to secure the black boxes.
Came the professional reply, then more quietly to himself.
We need to find out what happened here.
Good. Keep me updated. We need to find out what happened. Over?
She answered, her voice determined. A muffled answer responded. The voice was rushed, forceful.
Sorry, ma'am. There's nothing but carnage. The planet is off its axis. Every ship is destroyed. Radiation is off the charts. Should we proceed? Yes, ma'am.
The dismissive answer came. He frowned, brow line wrinkled, and his arms extended from his sides to prepare to suit up. Stepping inside, drawing it up, the thick pattern changing his body shape, and the snug layer gripped tight. A thick radiation suit was placed on top, while the other two assisted him inside and secured him, all except for the large helmet placed over his head. He and the two others walked through the planks. Their bright flashlights lit up the grim wreckage of one of the buildings. The black box was retrieved, and a camera on wheels sped around, recording the damage and inspecting to locate any forms of life.
No signs of any hostile life.
He breathed heavily, the frozen remains of a stunned child floating by him. The eyes locked open, with a single, solitary tear down her cheek. She clung to a stuffed teddy bear, and gently he moved her aside. They moved from ship to ship, finding only the black box with the records of what happened, and no living souls. The three men were weary, sadness in their hearts, and pressed on.
There's truly nothing but death.
A static response came.
We have the Liberty next.
He mused, scanning the ship. The screen showing all the damaged parts of the ship, and no dots indicating life.
No sign of...
There was a beep, a faint sign of life further up on the flight deck. He couldn't help but smile with joy. They made their way, using a laser drill to get through the metal, and looked at the sludge of dried human blood and flesh. One of his men lifted a blood-coated skull, holding it up to show them, and he shook his head, gestured for him to put it down. The reminder of unknown deaths was enough to destroy him. The trio gazed at the battered, twisted metal of the door, and they whispered what could have caused this. A chill ran down their spines, and a twisting feeling in their stomachs forewarned them of what was to come. Just what could have caused this kind of damage?
Get through here.
He sighed,
We have a job to do.
while watching the orange beam penetrate the doorway to remove the spiked, dangerous remnants of the thick security metal door. It squirted out a black gel, only to have them sidestep to avoid it. Finally, it was down, and with a gentle push, the inside part fell.
What the?
The static reminded him he was still on the clock. They stepped inside the flight deck, the command center, and stared out at the empty room, devoid of life, and noticed the cracked window. Thus far, it held. Outside, not that any of the three desired to get closer, was the empty void of space, all except for the corpse that clung on the outside, a witness to whatever had transpired here. While the two fetched the black box, going through metal, and during that time, when the pair worked, his attention was drawn elsewhere. The brown trail and the grooves in the floor suggested something moved through here. It had come from the outside, and then behind them, past the command center.
Ma'am, we're retrieving the black box now. No signs of the two crew members, Valrose and...
He paused, having been interrupted, waiting while the answer came through.
Yes, ma'am. No signs of life.
He saw something small on the ground, lifting it up with his gloved fingers and turning it, finally realizing it was a human finger, perhaps the last physical remains of a person. Turning it around to the third knuckle, he saw it was charred, and placed it in a secure bag. It would be sent back to the lab to DNA test to see who it belonged to. A mixture of dried clumps of hair clung to his gloves. Further investigation found skin in different levels of decay, and he wiped it on the outside of his suit.
Ma'am, we're under attack!
Static raged on the other end, followed by an unholy scream and warning sirens blaring out.
The Helios? It's here. But that's impossible.
She gasped.
We're under attack.
What the... Helios is there?
He exclaimed, stunned silent for a moment in disbelief.
You're being attacked there too?
More static, and he pressed multiple buttons, trying to assess the damage, and looked down at the screen in sheer confusion.
Corbin, we're under attack. Deploy.
The whole system is down. Ma'am? Ma'am, I can't hear you.
He watched both of his companions being taken by the great, fleshy mass. They screamed, trying to cling hopelessly onto the arms of the chairs. One was pulled with such great force to rip his legs off at the hips. They wriggled and jerked with a spurt of blood bursting upward. The arm of the chair snapped, the force plunging one inside the mass, with only a hopeful hand reaching up to the sky in a futile attempt for survival. Soon the rest were consumed, pulled away into the mass that now only grew, swelling more in number as more came from the vents, now with a desire to be close to the others, merging with it, their bodies breaking and twisting, breaking apart and being reborn in the mass, all becoming one. With those two now claimed, it advanced on him, and cornered there was nothing he could do. His commanding officer screamed at him, trying to get his attention, before the same gurgling, twisting sound of metal and flesh came from their end. He pressed the buttons, sending out a recorded distress call that was set to repeat forever.
This is Corbin of the Rising Dawn. We're under attack. I repeat, do not send anyone out for us. The organism takes control and lures more inside. Do not come in here. I repeat, do not.
Unfortunately, there were no more humans left to hear. And soon, his broadcast was added to all the others. The countless lives lost whose voices echoed for an eternity, and will be found by the next unfortunate biological source. And they too would be added to the great swirling mass. Thank you for joining me on this sci-fi tale. So, what did you think of the story? Let me know in the comment section down below. I'd like to thank my amazing guests, Vidith22, Mad Chatter or Dimensional Drift ASMR, the lovely Duchess of Darkness, and Weekly Creeps. Please check them out and subscribe if you enjoyed their contribution. This video and others like it, along with my writing, is supported by my amazing channel members and Patreon supporters. Join their ranks if you would like to receive exclusive perks, including special videos. If you haven't yet, check out the rest of my playlist, and I hope to see you at the next one. So be sure to stab the like button, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more spooky content. Also, follow me on my socials to see what I'm up to. All my links are down below. So, stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.